The year is 1872. A doctor in Richmond, Virginia opens an envelope postmarked from Boston. Inside, written in handwriting so precise it could have been printed, are the words, "I killed him. I am not sorry." The letter continues for 7 pages. Each sentence is a confession, each paragraph a revelation. And by the time Dr. Edmund Vorders finishes reading, his hands are trembling, because what he's holding isn't just a murder confession. It's proof that one of the most intelligent acts of resistance in American history has been hiding in plain sight for 12 years, disguised as natural death, dismissed as coincidence, buried under the very system it sought to destroy. The letter is signed, Benjamin Freeman, former property of Colonel Marcus Hafford, former slave, current murderer, and the architect of what might be the most patient, calculated, and terrifying revenge plot ever executed on American soil. But to understand what Benjamin did, and why Dr. Vorders chose to burn that letter rather than turn it over to authorities, we need to go back. Back to November 6, 1860. Back to a plantation in Virginia's tobacco country. Back to the night Abraham Lincoln won the presidency, and one man decided he would rather be a murderer than remain property for one more day. This is the story of how a slave weaponized his master's greatest pleasure, how he turned luxury into poison, how he made cigars into coffins, and how he walked away into freedom while his enemies smoked themselves to death, one by one, never knowing what killed them. Before we go deeper into what Benjamin did on that election night, I need something from you. If you've ever wondered how far someone would go to taste freedom, hit that subscribe button right now. Because stories like this, buried in history's darkest corners, are exactly what we uncover here. And drop a comment telling me, do you think what Benjamin did was murder or justice? Because by the end of this story, you're going to have to decide for yourself. Now, let's talk about tobacco. In 1860, tobacco wasn't just a crop in Virginia. It was currency. It was power. It was the foundation of an entire civilization built on the backs of human beings who had no choice but to grow it, cure it, process it, and watch white men get rich from their labor. Buckingham County sat in the heart of Virginia's tobacco belt, where the soil ran dark and rich, where the air smelled perpetually sweet from curing barns, and where a man's worth was measured by 2 things, the acres he owned and the people he enslaved to work them. The Hafford plantation sprawled across 12,000 acres. 90 enslaved people lived there, worked there, suffered there, and among them was a man named Benjamin, who everyone called Benj, who was quiet and careful and unremarkable in every way that mattered to white people, which was exactly how he wanted it. Benjamin was born on that plantation in 1826. His mother, Celia, worked in the main house until fever took her when Benjamin was 12. Before she died, she did something dangerous, something that could have gotten them both killed. She taught him to read. She used a stolen Bible and newspapers pulled from trash bins. She made him practice in the dark, by candlelight, after everyone else was asleep. And she made him swear, on everything he held sacred, that he would never reveal this skill. Because she knew what Benjamin came to understand. Knowledge was the most dangerous weapon a slave could possess. When his mother died, Benjamin continued his education in stolen moments. He read everything he could find: medical texts, agricultural manuals, newspapers, books on chemistry and botany that the colonel kept in his library. He memorized maps showing free states and slave states. He studied the debates in Congress. He learned about the world beyond the plantation's boundaries. And he learned about poison. Not all at once, not obviously. But page by page he discovered that the same tobacco that made Virginia wealthy could also kill a man if you knew how to concentrate it. That nicotine, the chemical that made smoking pleasurable, was also one of the most lethal substances in nature. That there was a razor-thin line between the dose that relaxed you and the dose that stopped your heart. He learned all of this while appearing to be nothing more than what white people expected. A simple Negro who knew his place, who had a talent for rolling cigars, who was useful enough to keep close but not threatening enough to watch carefully. And that was his first weapon, their underestimation. Colonel Marcus Hafford was 53 years old in the autumn of 1860. Tall, silver-haired, sharp-eyed. A man who believed himself enlightened because he didn't whip his slaves quite as often as his neighbors did. A man who thought small mercies made him beloved, when really they just made him less immediately hated. He'd earned his military title during the Mexican War, where he developed expensive tastes that his plantation wealth could barely satisfy. He married into Richmond tobacco money, which secured his fortune and his social standing. And he prided himself on being a progressive slave owner, whatever the hell that meant. He allowed garden plots. He permitted some slaves to learn trades. He called it kindness. Benjamin called it control dressed up in better clothes. But there was one thing the colonel truly valued Benjamin for: his cigars. Benjamin had been trained in tobacco preparation since he was a teenager. The skill took years to master. You had to know which leaves to select, how to age them, how to cure them, how to add just the right amount of rum or brandy for flavor. You had to understand humidity, temperature, time. You had to have patience and precision. Benjamin had both, which meant he had access. Access to the colonel's private office. Access to his study. Access to his bedroom when delivering cigars. Access to the tobacco stores, the curing barns, every single step of the cigar-making process. The colonel trusted Benjamin with his most prized possessions because Benjamin had never given him a reason not to. That trust would be the colonel's last mistake. Now understand something about the relationship between Benjamin and the colonel. It wasn't friendship. It couldn't be. You can't be friends with property. You can't trust someone who owns you. But the colonel believed they had something close to mutual respect. He'd say things like, "You're a good Negro, Benj. I've always treated you fairly, haven't I?" And Benjamin would say, "Yes, sir. Very grateful, sir." And inside his chest, where no white person could see, rage burned so hot it could have melted iron. Because treated fairly meant being valued at $1,800 on a household inventory. Less than a good horse, less than the chandelier in the dining room. Treated fairly meant watching the overseer whip field hands for minor infractions, while the colonel watched with no expression at all. Treated fairly meant living 34 years as property, knowing that everything you built, everything you learned, everything you loved could be taken from you on a whim. But Benjamin never let that rage show. He buried it deep, let it crystallize into something harder and colder than anger. Let it become purpose. The autumn of 1860 brought tension so thick you could taste it. The presidential election was approaching, and everyone knew it might tear the country apart. In Richmond, politicians thundered about states' rights. On plantations, men debated whether Virginia would follow South Carolina into secession if Lincoln won. And in the quarters, enslaved people whispered about what freedom might look like, though few dared to hope out loud. The colonel hosted a dinner party 2 weeks before the election. A dozen of Buckingham County's most prominent men gathered to discuss strategy. Benjamin served the meal, poured the wine, and listened to every word while his face showed nothing but dutiful service. They talked about mobilizing voters, about intimidation tactics, about contingency plans if the Republicans took power. One man suggested Lincoln's election might be the spark that ignites Southern independence. The colonel disagreed. Lincoln's election means nothing without congressional support. The man's a backwoods lawyer with delusions of adequacy. He'll be hamstrung from day one. Our way of life is ordained by God and secured by economics. No amount of northern moral posturing can change that. As Benjamin refilled the colonel's glass, their eyes met for just a moment. The colonel saw a servant. Benjamin saw a man who'd grown comfortable in his power. A man who'd forgotten that enslaved people were still human, still capable of thought, of planning, of rage. And in that moment, Benjamin made his final decision. He'd been preparing for months already, testing, calculating, learning exactly how much concentrated nicotine extract a man could absorb through his mouth and throat before it became lethal. Too little, and the colonel would just get sick. Too much, and death would come so fast that suspicion would be inevitable. The key was patience, gradual exposure over time, so symptoms could be attributed to natural causes: stress, rich food, too much alcohol, anything but the truth. Benjamin had been lacing the colonel's cigars for 3 months already, using extract rendered from tobacco stems and low-quality leaves, the parts normally thrown away. He'd mixed it with the rum used for flavoring, applied it to the wrapper leaves, incorporated it into the binding. The doses had been small. The colonel experienced occasional nausea, some dizziness, nothing alarming. Benjamin watched carefully. Adjusted the dosage, learned how the colonel's body responded, found the threshold, and then he waited for the right moment. Election day arrived under gray November skies. Polls opened at dawn, though only white male property owners could vote, a fraction of the population. The colonel rode into town early, eager to cast his ballot and then wait at the courthouse for results. The news came before midnight. Abraham Lincoln had won. He'd carried the North decisively, and though he received not a single Southern electoral vote, the mathematics were undeniable. The courthouse erupted in fury. Men who'd been drinking all day drank harder. Their voices rose in rage and disbelief, and the colonel came home like a thunderstorm. His carriage rattled up the dark drive at dangerous speed around 2 in the morning. He stormed into the house, shouting for his wife, for whiskey, for Benjamin to bring his cigars. His face was flushed with alcohol and fury. His hands shook with rage. "It's done," he bellowed to anyone who could hear. "That rail-splitting bastard has won. But I'll be damned if it changes anything on my land. Do you hear me? Nothing changes here." He stalked into his study and slammed the door. Through the heavy wood, the household could hear him pacing, cursing, throwing things, and Benjamin stood in the hallway outside, waiting, because he knew the colonel would summon him. The man always smoked when agitated, and tonight he would smoke more than usual. Tonight, Benjamin would give him the special cigars, the ones he'd prepared for exactly this occasion, the ones with 5 times the normal concentration, the ones that would finish what 3 months of careful poisoning had begun. The study door opened. The colonel stood framed in lamplight, his cravat loosened, his eyes wild. "Benj, where the hell are you?" "Bring me my cigars." "The whole box. And brandy. The good French brandy." "Yes, sir," Benjamin replied, his voice steady as stone. "Right away, sir." He walked to the colonel's private closet where the best cigars were kept in a beautiful wooden humidor with Spanish cedar lining. Benjamin had prepared 2 identical boxes months ago. One contained his standard preparation. The other contained the cigars that would kill the colonel before dawn. Benjamin selected the lethal box, carried it to the study along with crystal brandy in a glass, and the colonel, drunk and furious and never suspecting that his most trusted slave had just handed him his own death, reached for the first cigar. "At least I still have these," he muttered, lighting it with trembling hands. "At least I still have the best damn tobacco in Virginia." Benjamin stood by the door, his face a mask of respectful attention. Inside, his heart hammered, but his hands didn't shake. His voice didn't waver. He'd spent 34 years learning to hide what he felt, learning to survive by appearing harmless, learning to wait, and now finally, the waiting was almost over. The colonel smoked steadily. One cigar after another, and with each draw, he pulled concentrated, death deeper into his body. Benjamin watched from his position by the door, silent, still, his face showing nothing while his master consumed poison disguised as pleasure. The colonel rambled while he smoked, about northern aggression, about states' rights, about the Constitution and God's will and the natural order of things. His words grew increasingly slurred, his movements less coordinated, but he kept smoking, kept drinking, kept feeding his rage with brandy and tobacco. "You're a good Negro, Benj," the colonel said at one point, his eyes struggling to focus. "I've always treated you fairly, haven't I? Given you important work, trusted you with responsibilities. You're grateful for that, aren't you?" "Yes, sir," Benjamin replied, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "Very grateful, sir." The colonel nodded, satisfied, and reached for his 3rd cigar. His hand trembled as he brought it to his lips. "Feeling oddly warm," he muttered. "Must be the brandy." But it wasn't the brandy. It was his heart racing, trying desperately to compensate as his nervous system began shutting down. Nicotine in concentrated doses does something terrifying to the human body. It makes your heart beat faster while simultaneously paralyzing the muscles you need to breathe. You remain conscious almost until the end, aware of what's happening, unable to stop it. Benjamin knew this from his reading. He'd memorized every symptom from that medical text he'd found in the colonel's library years ago. He knew exactly what was happening inside his master's body right now, even if the colonel didn't. By the fourth cigar, the colonel's skin had taken on a grayish color. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the November chill. His breathing became labored, each breath requiring visible effort. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. He fell back into the leather chair, his hands clutching at his chest. "Don't feel well," he gasped. "Something's wrong, Benj. Get the doctor." "Right away, sir," Benjamin said. But he didn't move. He stood there watching, waiting, witnessing the end of 34 years of bondage. The colonel's eyes widened as understanding dawned. Even through the fog of alcohol and poison, even with his mind shutting down, he realized. He looked at Benjamin, really looked at him, and saw past the mask of servitude for the first time. "You," he whispered. "You did this." Benjamin said nothing. His face remained expressionless. But inside, something that had been clenched tight for 3 decades finally loosened. The colonel tried to call out, but his throat had swollen shut. His voice came out as a strangled wheeze. He reached toward Benjamin with one shaking hand, whether in appeal or accusation. Benjamin couldn't tell and didn't care. He watched as the colonel's breathing became increasingly shallow and rapid. Watched as the man's hand fell back to the armrest. Watched as his master's eyes glazed over. Watched as his chest went still. The study clock chimed 4 times. Outside, the first birds began singing in the darkness before dawn. Inside, Colonel Marcus Hafford slumped in his chair, his lips stained dark from tobacco. 4 cigars burned down to nubs in the ashtray beside him. Dead. Benjamin finally moved. He walked to the colonel and checked for a pulse, his fingers steady against cooling skin. Nothing. He collected the cigar box containing the poisoned cigars and replaced it with the identical box of normal ones. He arranged the scene carefully, making sure everything looked like a man who'd drunk and smoked himself into an early grave. Overcome by rage and anxiety on the worst night of his political life. Then he walked out of the study, closing the door quietly behind him. He returned to his small room in the servants' quarters attached to the main house. Lay down on his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling until the sun rose. He felt nothing. No triumph, no guilt, no fear. Just a vast emptiness where emotion should have been, and the certain knowledge that this was only the beginning. The household discovered the body at 7 that morning when the colonel's wife, "Catherine, send a maid to wake him for breakfast." The girl's screams brought everyone running. Catherine took one look at her husband's gray face and collapsed in hysterics. The overseer, Silas Portwood, sent a rider for the doctor while trying to maintain order among the increasingly agitated household. Dr. Nathaniel Grimby arrived within the hour. A middle-aged man with spectacles and a perpetually worried expression, he'd attended the colonel for years. He examined the body thoroughly, noting the discoloration, the position, the evidence of heavy smoking and drinking. He questioned Catherine about her husband's state of mind the previous evening, documented the political stress and excessive celebration, and then he made his diagnosis: apoplexy, brought on by excessive agitation, alcohol consumption, and tobacco use. I've seen it before in men of the colonel's age and temperament. The shock of the election results, combined with his intemperate habits, proved too much for his constitution. Catherine accepted this explanation through her tears. The servants accepted it because they had no choice. The neighbors who came to pay respects accepted it because it fit their understanding of how the world worked. Prominent men sometimes died suddenly from stroke or heart failure, especially during times of stress. There was nothing suspicious about it. Only Benjamin knew the truth, and he carried that knowledge like a stone in his chest. Heavy, but manageable. The funeral took place 3 days later under cold November rain. Nearly 200 people attended, filling the small church in town and spilling into the muddy churchyard. They buried the colonel in the family plot beside his parents and the infant son who'd died years earlier. The minister delivered a lengthy eulogy praising the colonel's service to Virginia, his business acumen, his kindness to those who depended on him. Benjamin stood in the back with the other house servants, his head bowed respectfully, listening to the minister describe a man he'd never known. The colonel the minister eulogized bore no resemblance to the man who'd told Benjamin he was worth less than a cigar, who'd watched without expression as the overseer whipped people for minor infractions, who'd sold a woman's children to settle a gambling debt. That man wasn't mentioned. That man never existed according to the white people gathered to mourn. But Benjamin remembered him, and Benjamin had killed him, and now Benjamin had to decide what came next. After the funeral, the plantation fell into uneasy limbo. Catherine retreated to her rooms and didn't emerge for a week. Work continued in the fields and barns, but without the colonel's driving presence, everything moved slower. Questions of ownership and management remained unresolved. The colonel had died without a will. His nearest male relative was a nephew in Charleston who showed no interest in managing a Virginia tobacco plantation. And then, 2 weeks after the colonel's funeral, Silas Portwood died. The overseer was found slumped over his desk one morning, surrounded by evidence of heavy smoking. The local doctor was called again. Dr. Grimby examined the body, noted the similar presentation to the colonel's death, and made the same diagnosis: apoplexy. But this time, doubt flickered in his mind. 2 men, both dead within weeks of each other, both presenting with similar symptoms. He documented his concerns in his private journal, but said nothing publicly. What could he say? That he suspected foul play without evidence? That 2 sudden deaths might be connected? On what basis? The plantation's enslaved population whispered about divine justice, about curses, about the wages of sin. But they kept their voices low and their theories private. They'd learned long ago that survival meant silence. Catherine, thoroughly unnerved, accelerated her plans to leave Virginia. The plantation would be sold. She would return to Richmond, to her father's house, where she'd be safe from whatever was happening in Buckingham County, and Benjamin, still moving through the plantation like water, still showing nothing on his face, began preparing for his own departure, because he'd never intended to stay after killing the colonel. The murder was just the first step. Freedom was the goal, but Benjamin didn't run the day after the colonel died, or the week after, or even the month after. He waited, planned, prepared, because running blindly would get him caught, and getting caught meant death. He needed papers, though he didn't have any. He needed money, though slaves weren't paid. He needed to know the routes north, the safe houses, the people who might help. And he needed to make sure that even after he left, his revenge would continue. That last part was crucial, because Benjamin understood something that most people didn't. The colonel wasn't the disease. He was just one symptom of a much larger sickness. Killing him didn't fix anything. The system remained. Other men would come. Other men would profit from that blood-soaked land. So Benjamin spent his evenings in the months after the colonel's death preparing more cigars. Special cigars. He rendered nicotine extract from tobacco stems and low-quality leaves. He mixed it carefully, precisely, into dozens of premium cigars that looked and smelled exactly like the colonel's favorites. He packaged them in beautiful wooden boxes with Spanish cedar lining, and he hid them throughout the plantation, in the humidors where the colonel had kept his best tobacco. In the overseer's office, in the main house's smoking room, in storage areas that would eventually be inventoried and sold along with the property. Every man who purchased the Hafford plantation would inherit not just land and buildings, but a slow death hidden in wooden boxes. Every man who lit one of those specially prepared cigars would be consuming poison, building up toxic levels in his bloodstream until his body could no longer compensate. Benjamin calculated it perfectly. The deaths would be spaced far enough apart to seem like coincidence. The symptoms would match known natural causes, and by the time anyone suspected murder, he'd be long gone, impossible to find, impossible to prosecute. It was revenge not just for himself, but for every person the colonel had owned. Every person Portwood had whipped, every family the system had torn apart. It was justice administered through chemistry and patience, delivered through the very symbol of plantation wealth and status. In the colonel's study, which Catherine had kept locked since her husband's death, there were documents Benjamin needed. Deeds, contracts, account books, correspondence, evidence of business dealings, debts, investments, names of Confederate sympathizers, information about weapons caches, supply lines, plots to disrupt Union forces. This information could be valuable to the right people, very valuable indeed. 2 weeks before Catherine's planned departure for Richmond, Benjamin made his move. He waited for a cloudy, moonless night when Portwood, had he still been alive, would have ridden into town. Using a key he'd made months earlier from a wax impression, Benjamin let himself into the colonel's study. Working by the light of a shielded candle, he committed the most important documents to memory. He couldn't take the originals without raising suspicion, but he had a good memory, trained by years of secret reading. Names, dates, amounts, locations, evidence of Confederate weapons caches, lists of Southern sympathizers in northern cities, correspondence suggesting plots against Union interests. He found the deed to the plantation, noting property boundaries and neighboring landowners. He found the household inventory, including the names and estimated values of every enslaved person on the property. His own name was there. Benjamin, age 34, tobacco specialist. Valued at $1,800, that was what he was worth to these people. Less than a good horse, less than the furniture in the room where he stood. He memorized it all, then carefully returned everything to its place. Locked the study door, slipped back to his room without being seen. 3 days later, he disappeared. The discovery of Benjamin's absence came at dawn when the cook needed tobacco for the household's morning supply. She sent a boy to fetch him, but his room was empty. His few possessions were gone. His palate was cold. A search of the plantation revealed nothing. Benjamin had vanished like smoke. Catherine, when informed, seemed more bewildered than angry. "But why would he run?" she asked. "We always treated him well. He had important work. Why would he throw all that away?" The answer, of course, was that Benjamin had never had anything to throw away. He'd only had a slightly more comfortable form of bondage, and he'd chosen possible freedom over certain slavery. But Catherine, like her husband before her, couldn't understand that the people she owned might have desires and dreams beyond serving her comfort. Professional slave catchers were hired from Richmond. Men with dogs and guns and no mercy. They searched the woods, questioned enslaved people on neighboring properties, followed roads north toward Washington. They found nothing. Benjamin had disappeared as completely as if the earth had swallowed him, because Benjamin hadn't run north on the roads, where patrols and checkpoints made passage nearly impossible for a black man without papers. He'd gone west instead, into the mountains, following paths known only to runaways and the few white abolitionists who aided them. He connected with the Underground Railroad in the foothills of the Blue Ridge, was passed from safe house to safe house, made his way slowly, carefully, toward Pennsylvania, then Massachusetts, then Boston. By July of 1861, Benjamin was free, working as a laborer in a warehouse, living in a cramped boarding house, poor, but no longer property. By August, he'd made contact with certain individuals who understood the value of intelligence from behind Confederate lines, people who worked for the Union, who needed information about Southern sympathizers, weapons caches, supply routes. By September, Benjamin was sharing what he knew: names, locations, evidence, everything he'd memorized from the Colonel's papers. And while he built a new life in Boston, while he learned to navigate freedom, while he tried to figure out who he was beyond the role of slave he'd played for 34 years, back in Virginia, something strange was happening. Men kept dying on the Havard plantation. The property was sold to a speculator from Richmond who planned to run it with hired overseers, while focusing on more profitable wartime business. He lasted 6 months. Found dead in the plantation's main house study, his lips stained dark, expensive cigars burned to ash beside him. Dr. Grimby was called again. Made the same diagnosis again, but this time he was deeply troubled. 3 men, 3 deaths, all in the same location, all presenting with similar symptoms. He confided his concerns to the sheriff, who suggested that perhaps the study itself was the problem. Bad air, miasma from the river, something in the ventilation. They had the study cleaned and aired. Burned sulfur candles. Brought in a builder to check for rot or mold. They found nothing. Just a well-appointed room with book-lined shelves, a large desk, and a persistent smell of tobacco smoke that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. The property changed hands twice more during the war, each time at a lower price. Neither owner lived there long. By 1863, the Havard plantation had acquired a reputation. People in Buckingham County called it cursed, a place where death lingered in the very walls. The enslaved population had been sold and scattered. The fields went unplanted. The house stood empty, its windows dark, its doors locked, and Dr. Grimby, troubled by the pattern of deaths, began keeping detailed notes in his private journal. He documented each case, noted similarities, searched for a pattern that made medical sense. In an entry dated March 1863, he wrote something that came remarkably close to the truth. I am increasingly convinced that the deaths at the Hafford property are not natural, though I cannot determine the mechanism. All victims were smokers of expensive cigars. All died with similar presentations. The symptoms are consistent with nicotine poisoning at concentrations that should not be possible from ordinary tobacco use. Could the cigars themselves have been deliberately tainted? But by whom and when? He never published these suspicions. The war was raging. He had more immediate concerns. His journal remained private, locked in a drawer. But he wasn't wrong. Benjamin hadn't just killed the colonel and escaped to freedom. He'd left behind a legacy. A weapon that continued to fire long after he'd pulled the trigger. A curse that wasn't supernatural at all, but chemical, calculated, entirely human. And in Boston, working honestly as a tobacconist under his new name, Benjamin Freeman heard occasional news from Virginia. Whispers through the networks of formerly enslaved people. Stories about the Hafford plantation, about its reputation, about the string of mysterious deaths. And when he heard these stories, Benjamin's face showed nothing at all. Boston in 1861 was a city of contradictions. Freedom existed there, at least on paper, but prejudice ran just as deep as anywhere else. Benjamin discovered quickly that escaping slavery didn't mean escaping the color of his skin or what white people assumed about him. Because of it, he worked long hours in a warehouse, for wages that barely covered rent and food. He lived in a cramped room in a boarding house where the landlord watched him with suspicious eyes. He walked streets where people crossed to the other side when they saw him coming, but he was free. He could walk away from a job if he chose. He could keep the money he earned. He could learn to read without hiding it. He could speak his mind without measuring every word for signs of insolence. It wasn't paradise, but it wasn't bondage either. Benjamin took the surname Freeman for obvious reasons. He told people he'd escaped from Virginia, but offered no details about his former master or the circumstances of his departure. Most people didn't ask. The city was filling with refugees from the South, people with stories they didn't want to tell. What Benjamin did share was his skill with tobacco. He'd spent 2 decades learning the craft, and that knowledge was worth something even in the North. Within a year, he'd moved from warehouse work to employment at a tobacconist's shop. Within 2 years, he'd saved enough to open his own small business on Beacon Street. Freeman's tobacco became known for quality. Benjamin selected leaves with the eye of someone who'd handled millions of them. He aged tobacco properly, rolled cigars with precision, treated every customer with quiet professionalism. His shop was clean, his products reliable, his prices fair, and nobody who purchased a cigar from Benjamin Freeman ever got sick. Because the man who'd weaponized tobacco in Virginia was careful, almost obsessively careful, about the products he sold in Massachusetts. He wanted no association, however distant, with death and cigars. He met a woman named Harriet in 1863. She was a seamstress, born free in Philadelphia, who'd moved to Boston to escape the racism that made life in Pennsylvania suffocating even for free blacks. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and unimpressed by Benjamin's quiet demeanor until she realized it wasn't submission but strategy. They married in 1864, had their first child in 1865. A daughter they named Celia. After Benjamin's mother, Benjamin became a deacon at his church, a respected member of Boston's growing black community, a business owner, a husband, a father. He built a life that looked from the outside completely ordinary. But at night, sometimes, he would wake from dreams about a study in Virginia, about a man dying in a leather chair, about boxes of cigars hidden throughout a plantation, and he would lie there in the darkness, listening to Harriet breathe beside him, and feel nothing at all about what he'd done. No guilt. No satisfaction. Just a sense that he'd balanced some cosmic equation that had been weighted against him since birth. Meanwhile, back in Virginia, the deaths continued. The war ended in 1865. The Confederacy collapsed. Slavery was abolished, and the Hafford plantation sat empty, slowly deteriorating. Its reputation as cursed ground now fully established in local legend. In 1868, a Union veteran named Harold Graham purchased the property for a fraction of its pre-war value. Graham was a Pennsylvania man who'd made a fortune selling supplies to the Army. Now he wanted to establish himself as a Virginia landowner, prove that Northern efficiency could succeed where Southern slavery had failed. He'd heard the rumors about the property but dismissed them as superstition. Ghost stories invented by a defeated people trying to explain their own failures. Guillaume was a cigar enthusiast. He'd acquired expensive tastes during the war and prided himself on his collection. So when he moved into the Hafford mansion and discovered several boxes of cigars in a hidden compartment in the study, apparently overlooked by previous owners or looters, he was delighted. The cigars appeared to be in excellent condition despite their age. The wooden boxes had protected them perfectly. Guillaume recognized quality tobacco when he saw it. He tested one cigar and found it exceptional. Rich flavor, complex notes, flawless construction. He made a note in his diary about his good fortune. His wife Margaret worried about smoking cigars of unknown origin, but Guillaume laughed off her concerns. "These are Virginia's finest tobacco, my dear," he said. "Better than anything you can buy in Philadelphia." The previous owner clearly had excellent taste. He smoked them regularly throughout that summer. Worked in the study making plans to restore the plantation to profitability using free labor and northern efficiency. By September, he was frequently ill. Dizziness, nausea, irregular heartbeat. The local doctor attributed these symptoms to Virginia heat and the stress of managing a large property. Prescribed rest and moderation. Guillaume ignored the advice, continued smoking, continued pushing himself, continued making plans for the future. By October, his symptoms had worsened dramatically. His hands trembled constantly. His skin took on a grayish cast. He experienced episodes where his heart would race uncontrollably, leaving him gasping for breath. His wife brought in a specialist from Richmond. Dr. Edmund Vorders examined Guillaume thoroughly and diagnosed chronic nicotine poisoning. When he asked about tobacco use, Guillaume admitted to smoking 5 or 6 cigars daily. "That's excessive," Dr. Vorders said bluntly. "But it shouldn't produce symptoms this severe unless the tobacco itself is unusually potent or contaminated." He asked to examine Guillaume's cigars. Took several back to Richmond for analysis by a chemist at the Medical College of Virginia. The chemist's report, delivered 2 weeks later, was alarming. The cigars contained nicotine at concentrations 4 to 5 times higher than normal. More disturbing, the distribution was uneven, suggesting deliberate adulteration rather than natural variation. Someone had infused these cigars with concentrated nicotine extract. Essentially turned them into poison delivery devices. Dr. Vorders immediately sent word to Guillaume to stop smoking the cigars and destroy them. The message arrived too late. Guillaume had died the night before, alone in his study, a half-smoked cigar still clutched between his fingers. Dr. Vorders didn't let this go. He knew the Hafford plantation's history, knew about the previous deaths. He requested access to Dr. Grimby's papers and was eventually given permission to review the old doctor's private journals. Reading Grimby's suspicions, Vorders began piecing together a pattern that stretched back 8 years. All the deaths involved men who'd purchased the Hafford plantation. All occurred in or around the study. All involved heavy cigar smoking. All presented with symptoms consistent with nicotine poisoning. The first death, Colonel Hafford himself, had occurred in November 1860, the night of Lincoln's election. The colonel had been a heavy smoker whose cigars were prepared by a slave named Benjamin. Benjamin had disappeared shortly after the colonel's death. What if Benjamin hadn't just been running from slavery? What if he'd been fleeing from murder? What if he'd spent months, perhaps years, carefully poisoning his owner through the very cigars the colonel prized? And what if, before escaping, he'd prepared more poisoned cigars and hidden them throughout the plantation, knowing they'd eventually find new victims? Vorders couldn't prove any of this. Benjamin, if he was still alive, was somewhere in the north, beyond Virginia's jurisdiction. The other potential witnesses, the enslaved people who'd lived on the plantation, had been sold and scattered during the war. The physical evidence had been destroyed on his own orders, but the pattern was undeniable. Someone had weaponized tobacco, had turned the plantation's cash crop into an instrument of revenge, had created a curse that wasn't supernatural at all, but chemical. Dr. Vorders documented his theory in a detailed report. Laid out the evidence, explained the medical mechanism. The sheriff filed it away, unsure what to do with accusations against a man who'd been gone for nearly a decade. The Guillaume family sued the Commonwealth of Virginia, claiming they'd been sold a death trap. The case dragged through courts for 2 years before being dismissed. The Hafford plantation reverted to the state once again. This time, nobody would buy it. The property's reputation was sealed. Cursed ground, a place where death waited in the walls. Local people told stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Angry ghosts, land soaked in suffering, tobacco fields that refused to grow, buildings that repelled all inhabitants. But the truth, as Vorders understood it, was more terrifying than any ghost story. The curse was human, calculated, patient. It was the revenge of a man who'd been reduced to property, who'd studied his oppressors' weaknesses and exploited them with methodical precision. And then, in 1872, a letter arrived at Dr. Vorders' office, postmarked from Boston. No return address. Inside, written in precise handwriting, was a confession. "Sir," it began, "I understand you have been investigating the deaths at the former Hafford plantation in Buckingham County. I write to inform you that your suspicions are correct. My name is Benjamin Freeman, formerly the property of Colonel Marcus Hafford. I killed him. I also killed Silas Portwood and created the means by which several other men died. I am not sorry." The letter continued for 7 pages. Benjamin laid out everything: his years of secret study, his discovery of nicotine's properties as poison, his experiments with concentration and dosage, his careful testing to find the threshold between illness and death. "I began with small doses," he wrote, "mixed into the Colonel's cigars over months. He felt unwell but attributed it to other causes. His body was building tolerance but also accumulating damage. By election night he was already compromised. The heavily dosed cigars I prepared for that evening merely finished what months of preparation had begun." He described preparing additional boxes of poisoned cigars before his escape, his decision to hide them throughout the plantation. "I knew the property would be sold," he explained. "I knew other men would come. Men who saw profit in land where I and others had suffered. I left them gifts, boxes of the finest tobacco, aged and rolled to perfection, infused with concentrated death. Whoever found them would think themselves fortunate. They would smoke and they would die as the Colonel died." The letter explained his escape north, his journey to Boston, his new life. "I am now a tobacconist," he wrote. "I use my legitimate skills to earn an honest living. I have married. I have children. I am, by all measures, a respectable member of my community." And then came the part that Dr. Vorders would remember for the rest of his life. "I tell you this not from guilt, for I feel none, but from a desire for truth. The world should know that what happened at the Hafford plantation was not mysterious. It was deliberate action by a man who'd been told his entire life that he was property, that he existed only to serve, that his thoughts and feelings and humanity meant nothing. I proved them wrong. I proved that enslaved people were capable of great complexity of thought, of planning, of execution. I proved we could achieve goals requiring patience, intelligence, and skill. In killing my oppressor with his own cigars, I demonstrated more sophistication than most of them credited any Negro with possessing. That demonstration, sir, was as much the point as the revenge itself." Dr. Vorders sat in his office for a long time after reading that letter. He held it in his hands, staring at the careful handwriting, considering what to do. He was technically in possession of a murder confession. Benjamin Freeman had admitted to multiple killings, provided enough detail to remove any doubt. But Vorders was also a man who'd lived through the war, who'd seen slavery firsthand, who'd treated wounds on both sides and come to his own conclusions about the institution. He thought about Colonel Hafford, who'd owned 90 human beings and considered it his God-given right. He thought about Portwood, who'd whipped people with mechanical efficiency. He thought about the speculators who'd purchased the plantation, hoping to profit from blood-soaked land. Then he thought about Benjamin Freeman, who'd been born into slavery, who'd educated himself in secret, who'd endured decades of degradation, and who'd finally struck back using nothing but intelligence and patience. What purpose would be served by prosecution? Benjamin Freeman was living peacefully in Boston. He'd built a respectable life. He had a family. He'd taken his revenge on a system that had stolen 34 years of his life, and now he was free. After considerable deliberation, Dr. Vorders walked to his fireplace and burned the letter. He watched the paper curl and blacken, watched Benjamin's confession turn to ash. He told no one about its contents, made no report to authorities. Instead, he wrote his own account of the Hafford plantation deaths, documented the medical evidence of nicotine poisoning, but attributed it to unknown parties, likely among the former enslaved population. Identity uncertain, whereabouts unknown. He filed the report and considered the matter closed. If Benjamin Freeman was living peacefully, what purpose would vengeance serve? The man had been property. Under Virginia law, he'd had no rights, no recourse against abuse, no hope of justice through legitimate channels. He'd created his own justice. And Dr. Vorders couldn't bring himself to condemn him for it. The Hafford plantation remained unsold through the 1870s and 1880s. The buildings deteriorated. Local children dared each other to approach after dark. The stories grew more elaborate, more supernatural. But among formerly enslaved people, now scattered across Virginia and beyond, different stories circulated. Stories told in churches and gathering halls, in private conversations held far from white ears. They spoke of Benj, of the tobacco man who made his master smoke death. The stories were always vague, always careful, but the message was clear. Resistance was possible, even for those who seemed powerless. One elderly woman told her grandchildren in 1891 about a conversation she'd had with Benjamin years before his escape. They'd been at a quilting bee, where enslaved people from several plantations gathered. Benjamin had been quiet as always, but at one point he'd said something that stuck with her. Tobacco built this world. Maybe tobacco can tear it down too. She hadn't understood at the time. Only later, after the deaths began, did his words take on new significance. By the time the main house burned in 1889, the property's fate was sealed. No developer would touch it. No farmer wanted to build near it. The very ground seemed tainted, though of course it wasn't the soil that was poisoned. It was memory, the land that had been enriched with blood and sweat and tears. The fields where 90 people had labored without choice. The quarters where families had been torn apart. The study where men had died smoking their own downfall. All of it remembered. All of it carried weight. And somewhere in Boston, Benjamin Freeman lived out his days, working his shop, raising his children, attending church, being, in all visible ways, an ordinary man. He died in 1894 at age 68. The obituary in the Boston newspaper described him as a respected member of the community, a deacon at his church, a skilled craftsman known for quality tobacco products. It made no mention of his birth in slavery, no mention of Virginia, no mention of the 34 years he'd spent as property or the revenge he'd taken. A black newspaper in Richmond published a different obituary, submitted anonymously. Benjamin Freeman, formerly of Buckingham County, died in Boston at age 68. He was a tobacconist of great skill, known for the care he took in his craft. He leaves behind a wife, 3 children, and a legacy that some will understand and others will never comprehend. May he rest in the freedom he earned. The notice generated no comment from white newspapers, but it was quietly reprinted in black publications across Virginia and as far north as Philadelphia, because the people who understood knew exactly what it meant. Benjamin Freeman had been born a slave, had become a murderer, had walked away into freedom, and had lived the rest of his life proving that he was human, capable, worthy of respect, that he was never property at all. The truth about Benjamin Freeman should have died with him, should have remained buried in ashes and forgotten journals and sealed county records. But truth has a way of persisting, even when people try to bury it, especially when people try to bury it. The first crack in the silence came in 1930, when a local historian researching pre-Civil War medical practices in Virginia stumbled across Dr. Grimby's journals in a Buckingham County Historical Society archive. The journals had been donated years earlier by Grimby's grandson, who'd found them while cleaning out an attic and thought they might have historical value. The historian was looking for information about cholera treatments. What he found instead was a doctor's growing suspicion that something deeply wrong was happening at the Hafford plantation. Entry after entry documenting similar deaths, similar symptoms, similar circumstances. The historian published a brief article in a regional journal, speculating about the strange pattern but offering no conclusions. The article generated little interest. Just another curiosity from Virginia's complicated past. But 30 years later, in 1958, a graduate student at the University of Virginia found that article while researching plantation life for her dissertation. She was intrigued, started pulling threads, found Dr. Vorders' papers in the Medical College of Virginia archives, found his unpublished account mentioning a letter from someone named Benjamin Freeman. Though the letter itself was long gone, she cross-referenced the name with Boston city directories from the 1870s and 1880s. Found a Benjamin Freeman listed as a tobacconist on Beacon Street. Married to Harriet. 3 children. Business operated successfully for over 20 years. She found his obituary in a Boston newspaper, then found the different obituary in a Richmond black newspaper with its cryptic reference to a legacy that some will understand. The student included her findings in her dissertation, framing them carefully, presenting them as suggestive but not conclusive evidence of an enslaved person's remarkable act of resistance. Her dissertation was accepted but not widely read until 1992, when another researcher working on a book about slave resistance found the dissertation and recognized its significance. She investigated further, found shipping records showing Hafford importing Cuban tobacco, found account books documenting the plantation's cigar production, found more details about the deaths, the timing, the pattern. She published a book titled Poison Tobacco: Benjamin Freeman and the Hafford Plantation Murders. The book presented the full story, drawing on all available documentation. It generated academic interest and modest controversy. Some scholars questioned whether the evidence was sufficient to prove Freeman's guilt beyond doubt. But to most readers, the truth was self-evident. Benjamin Freeman had weaponized his master's greatest pleasure, had turned luxury into death, had used chemistry and patience to strike back at the system that enslaved him, and he'd done it so skillfully that it took over a century for anyone to piece together what really happened. The book brought renewed attention to the Hafford plantation site, now subdivided farmland with no visible trace of its former identity. Local papers ran articles about the poison cigar murders. A few true crime podcasts covered the story. Historical societies held lectures. But the most interesting response came from descendants of formerly enslaved people who'd lived on the plantation. Some came forward with stories their grandparents had told them. Vague stories, careful stories, but stories that confirmed what Benjamin had done. One woman, whose great-great-grandmother had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation, shared a letter that had been passed down through her family. Written in 1895, the year after Benjamin's death, the letter was from a woman who'd known him before his escape. Benj was always watching, the letter said, always learning. We knew he could read, though he never said so. We knew he was planning something, though he never told us what. When the colonel died and Benji disappeared, we understood. We never spoke of it, because speaking would have brought danger. But we knew. And we were glad. The letter continued. What Benji did, he did for all of us. Not just for himself. He showed them we were human, that we could think and plan and act, that we were not the simple creatures they believed us to be. His revenge was our vindication. That letter is now preserved in the Virginia Historical Society archives, a testament to a truth that was hidden for generations, but never quite forgotten by those who needed to remember it most. Today, if you drive through Buckingham County, you'll find farmland where the Hafford plantation once stood. Corn and soybeans grow where tobacco once did. Modern houses dot the landscape. Nothing visible remains of the main house or the quarters or the study where so many men died. But the land remembers. History remembers. And the story of Benjamin Freeman refuses to stay buried because his story asks questions that don't have easy answers. Questions about justice and revenge, about morality and survival, about what human beings are capable of when pushed to the absolute edge of endurance. Was Benjamin Freeman a murderer? Legally, undeniably, yes. He deliberately killed multiple people using poison. He planned it carefully, executed it methodically, showed no remorse. But was he also something else? A freedom fighter? A resistance leader? A man driven to extremes by a system so brutal that violence became his only option for survival? The answer depends on where you stand, on what you believe about justice and the law, about whether some systems are so evil that any action against them becomes justified, about whether human beings can ever truly be property, and what it means when the property fights back. Benjamin Freeman never asked for forgiveness, never expressed doubt about what he'd done. He killed his master and walked away into freedom, then built a respectable life, proving he was capable of far more than slavery had ever allowed him to be. He was a husband, a father, a businessman, a deacon, a member of his community who contributed positively to society for over 30 years. He was also a killer who turned tobacco into weapons and felt nothing when his victims died. Both things are true. Both things exist in the same person, and that complexity is what makes his story so powerful, so disturbing, and so important. Now, before we close this chapter of history, I need to ask you something. This story, this piece of American history that was buried for over a century, is exactly the kind of truth we uncover here on The Sealed Room. These aren't the stories you'll find in textbooks. They're sealed away in old journals and archived letters and family memories passed down through generations. And I need your help to keep bringing them to light. If this story made you think, if it challenged your assumptions about history and justice and what human beings are capable of, then hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this. More truths hidden in sealed records and forgotten documents. More people like Benjamin Freeman whose actions were too complex, too uncomfortable, too challenging to fit neatly into the narratives we tell about our past. And drop a comment telling me what you think. Was Benjamin Freeman a murderer who deserved prosecution? Or was he a man who did what he had to do to survive and strike back at an evil system? There's no wrong answer here, just your honest response to a story that refuses to be simple, because that's what The Sealed Room is about. Opening doors that were meant to stay closed, examining truths that people tried to bury, and asking the hard questions that don't have easy answers. The legacy of Benjamin Freeman extends far beyond the men he killed. It lives in every story of resistance, every act of defiance against systems designed to crush human dignity. It lives in the proof that enslaved people were never the simple, childlike creatures their owners claimed them to be. They were human beings, capable of love and hate, patience and violence, sacrifice and revenge, capable of learning in secret, planning in silence, acting with devastating effectiveness when the moment came. Benjamin Freeman's intelligence and skill were products of his humanity, not exceptions to it. The colonel who owned him failed to see that humanity until it was too late. Until the very cigars he'd trusted Benjamin to prepare became the instruments of his death. That failure of imagination, that inability to see enslaved people as fully human, was the fatal weakness at the heart of the entire slave system. Benjamin exploited that weakness with precision. He used their underestimation against them, made them smoke their own downfall while believing themselves safe, superior, invincible. And in doing so, he proved something that the system couldn't acknowledge without collapsing. That there was no fundamental difference between the enslaved and the enslaver except power and circumstance. That given knowledge and opportunity, the people held as property could outwit, outplan, and destroy those who claimed to own them. The tobacco that built Virginia's wealth became, in Benjamin's hands, the instrument of its destruction, at least in one small corner of Buckingham County, at least for a few men who thought themselves untouchable. It's a small victory in the context of a system that enslaved millions, that tore families apart, that built an entire economic structure on human suffering. Benjamin's revenge didn't end slavery, didn't free anyone but himself, didn't change the fundamental injustice of the world he was born into, but it mattered. It mattered to him. It mattered to the people who whispered his story in churches and gathering halls. It mattered as proof that resistance was possible, even for those who seemed powerless. And it matters now, over 160 years later, as we try to understand the full complexity of American history. Not the sanitized version taught in schools, not the comfortable narrative that avoids hard questions, but the real, messy, complicated truth about what people did to survive, to resist, to claim their humanity in a system designed to deny it. Dr. Edmund Vorders understood this when he burned Benjamin's confession. He recognized that prosecuting a man for killing his enslaver would serve no purpose except to reinforce the very system that had created the situation in the first place. That judging Benjamin by the laws that had declared him property was absurd. That some forms of justice exist outside legal structures, especially when those structures are fundamentally unjust. Vorders' decision to destroy that letter was itself an act of resistance. A recognition that the law isn't always synonymous with justice. That sometimes the most moral choice is to let some truths remain officially hidden while ensuring they're not entirely lost. The Hafford plantation itself became a kind of memorial, though not an intentional one. The land that nobody would buy, the property that acquired a reputation for being cursed, the fields that returned to forest and the buildings that crumbled into ruin. All of it became a testament to the impermanence of systems that seem eternal. The plantation that had stood for generations as a symbol of Southern wealth and power became a symbol of that power's fragility. its vulnerability, its dependence on the cooperation, however forced, of the people it claimed to own. When those people stopped cooperating, when even one person with sufficient intelligence and patience decided to fight back, the entire structure could collapse. The master could die in his study. The property could become worthless. The land itself could be abandoned. Benjamin Freeman understood something profound about power. It's only as strong as people's belief in it. The colonel believed himself invincible because he'd never been seriously challenged. He believed enslaved people were incapable of sophisticated planning because he'd never looked closely enough to see the intelligence they carefully hid. That blindness killed him. And it killed the other men who followed him, who inherited not just his property but his assumptions, his arrogance, his fatal inability to imagine that the people they exploited might be capable of perfect, patient revenge. In the end, Benjamin Freeman lived exactly as long in freedom as he'd lived in slavery. 34 years of bondage. 34 years of liberty. A perfect symmetry that seems almost intentional, though it surely wasn't. He died in his bed, surrounded by family, his secrets intact. He was buried under a simple headstone in a Boston cemetery. And for over 60 years, the truth of what he'd done remained hidden, known only to a few people who'd burned the evidence or kept the knowledge carefully private. But truth, once created, never entirely disappears. It waits in archives and journals and family stories passed down through generations. It waits for someone to piece together the fragments, to ask the right questions, to see the pattern hiding in plain sight. And when that truth finally emerges, it challenges everything we thought we knew. It forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about our history, our moral assumptions, our understanding of justice and revenge. Benjamin Freeman killed his master with poisoned cigars on the night Abraham Lincoln was elected president. He killed other men through delayed action revenge that continued long after his escape. He showed no remorse, built a respectable life, died free and surrounded by family. Was he a monster? A hero? A victim who became a victimizer? A freedom fighter who crossed lines that should never be crossed? The answer is that he was human. Fully, completely, undeniably human. Capable of everything humans are capable of, the good and the terrible and the complicated. He was never property. He was always a person. And what he did, for better or worse, was prove that in the most dramatic way possible. His story refuses to be simple because people refuse to be simple. Because history refuses to be simple. Because the line between justice and revenge, between resistance and murder, between survival and sin, is never as clear as we want it to be. And that's why this story matters. Not because it provides easy answers, but because it asks hard questions. Not because it makes us comfortable, but because it challenges us to think beyond our assumptions. Not because it fits neatly into the narratives we tell about our past, but because it forces us to acknowledge how complicated and painful and morally ambiguous that past really was. The study where Colonel Hafford died is gone now. The cigars that killed him turned to ash over a century ago. The plantation that seemed eternal is now just farmland divided among owners who don't remember what happened there. But Benjamin Freeman's story survives, passed down through whispers and journal entries and archived letters, through the determined work of researchers who refused to let uncomfortable truths stay buried, through descendants who kept family stories alive even when they couldn't speak them openly. It survives because it needs to survive, because understanding our history requires confronting all of it, not just the parts that make us comfortable, because people like Benjamin Freeman existed, and what they did mattered, and forgetting them means losing something essential about who we are and where we came from. So remember his name. Benjamin Freeman, born Benjamin, property of Marcus Hafford, died Benjamin Freeman, respected member of his community, 34 years enslaved, 34 years free, murderer and father, killer and deacon, victim and victor. Remember that he could read when reading was forbidden, that he could plan when planning seemed impossible, that he could kill with such perfect patience that it took over a century for anyone to fully understand what he'd done. Remember that tobacco built an empire. And tobacco, in the hands of one man who refused to remain property, helped tear that empire down. One death at a time, one poisoned cigar at a time, one act of perfect, calculated, unforgivable, and somehow understandable revenge at a time. Remember that the masters smoked their own downfall, literally inhaled the concentrated essence of their crime, and never knew until too late what was happening to them. Remember that the land that seemed cursed was never cursed at all. It was just haunted by truth, by memory, by the weight of suffering and the proof that suffering sometimes fights back. And remember that some doors were meant to be sealed, some truths were meant to be buried, some stories were meant to be forgotten. But here we are, over 160 years later, still talking about Benjamin Freeman, still asking what his story means, still trying to understand whether what he did was unforgivable murder or justified resistance or both at once. The sealed room has been opened. The buried truth has been uncovered. The story that was whispered in private for generations can now be told openly. And Benjamin Freeman, wherever he is, has finally gotten something he never had in life: the acknowledgement that he was human, that he mattered, that his actions, however troubling, were the actions of a person capable of sophisticated thought and devastating execution. He was never property. He was always human, and his revenge proved it in a way that can never be denied. That's the story. That's the truth. That's what happened in a study in Virginia on election night 1860, and in the years that followed, and in the decades of silence after that. Make of it what you will. Judge it however you need to, but don't forget it, because Benjamin Freeman didn't kill his master just for revenge. He did it to prove something, to demonstrate that the people held as property were capable of anything their owners were capable of. More even, because they had to be smarter, more careful, more patient, more willing to wait years for the perfect moment to strike. And when they struck with devastating precision. The colonel died smoking his favorite cigars, prepared by the one man he trusted most. And that trust, that blindness, that fatal inability to see enslaved people as fully human, was what killed him in the end. Not the poison, not the nicotine, not even Benjamin Freeman, but the system itself. The assumptions that made it possible, the blindness that made it sustainable, the lie that allowed men to own other men and sleep soundly at night. That lie killed the colonel. Benjamin Freeman just helped it along, and that's the truth that was buried for over a century. The truth that people try to forget, the truth that refuses to stay silent, the truth we've unsealed tonight.